The snow was red before he even saw her face. In the dead heart of winter 1883, a man who'd sworn off humanity found a woman who should have been a corpse. She had a gun, a secret that could burn an empire, and killers already on her trail. He walked away once, then the storm came, then the bullets, then the choice no man wants to make: die alone like you planned, or fight for someone who might be worth breaking every rule you ever made. This is their story. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this tale travels. Now let's begin. The blood was 3 days old. Ronan Hale could tell by the way it had frozen into the snow. Not bright red anymore, but rust-colored, crusty at the edges where the cold had worked its way in. He knelt in the powder, his rifle slung across his back, and studied the trail with the same cold focus he gave everything in these mountains. 3 days meant the elk was probably dead already. Frozen stiff somewhere in a ravine, coyotes already working on what was left. But he'd tracked it this far. Might as well finish. The San Juan Mountains in January didn't forgive halfway measures. He rose, knees cracking, and followed the blood west through the pines. His breath came out in white clouds that vanished almost instantly in the thin air. Elevation up here sat around 11,000 feet, high enough that the wind cut through wool like it was cheesecloth, and the sun disappeared behind the peaks by 3 in the afternoon. Most folks called this country unlivable. Ronan called it home. He'd been up here 6 years now, longer than he'd stayed anywhere since the war, long enough that the silence didn't bother him anymore, long enough that the sight of another human being felt like an intrusion rather than a relief. He had his cabin, his trap lines, his routines. He had winter stores and a decent rifle and the kind of solitude that most men would call loneliness, but he called peace. The blood trail bent north. That was wrong. Elk didn't go north this time of year. North meant higher elevation, deeper snow, less forage. A wounded animal went downhill, toward the valleys, toward easier ground. Ronan stopped and scanned the tree line, looking for movement, for tracks, for anything that would explain why the blood was leading him upslope instead of down. Nothing moved. The forest was silent except for the wind. He followed anyway. 20 minutes later, the blood stopped entirely. Ronan stood at the edge of a small clearing, frowning at the snow. The trail just ended. No body. No signs of a struggle. No scavengers. Just a smooth white expanse that looked like it hadn't been disturbed in days. He turned in a slow circle, scanning the ground, the trees, the underbrush. Nothing made sense. Then he saw the footprint. It was small, delicate. A boot, maybe a woman's size, pressed into the snow about 10 feet from where the blood trail ended. He walked over and crouched beside it, his pulse ticking up despite himself. The print was fresh, no more than a few hours old. He could still see the tread pattern, the way the heel had sunk deeper than the toe, like whoever made it had been moving slow. Careful. There was no blood in the print, no sign of injury. Ronan straightened and looked around the clearing again, this time with a different kind of attention. The blood trail hadn't been elk. It had been bait, or a lure, or a coincidence so unlikely that his instincts were already screaming at him to turn around and head back to his cabin. He didn't turn around. Instead, he followed the footprints. They led him northeast, away from the clearing, into a stretch of forest so dense with lodgepole pine that the snow beneath the canopy was thin and patchy. Whoever had made the prints was light on their feet. The impressions were shallow, barely visible in places. But they were consistent, purposeful. Someone who knew how to move in the woods without making a mess of it. After a quarter mile, he smelled smoke. It was faint, just a trace of burning pine and something else, something chemical, like kerosene or pitch. Ronan slowed his pace, every sense alert now. Smoke meant fire. Fire meant people. People meant trouble. He moved off the trail and circled wide, approaching the source from downwind. The trees thinned out ahead, and through the gaps he could see a structure, a cabin, maybe, or what was left of one. The roof had collapsed on the left side, and the walls leaned inward like a drunk trying to stay upright. Smoke curled from a stovepipe that jutted at an angle from the sagging roof. Ronan stopped behind a thick pine and watched. No movement. No sound except the wind and the faint crackle of a fire inside. He waited 5 minutes, then 10. Patience was a skill you learned fast up here, and Ronan had learned it better than most. Finally, when he was reasonably sure no one was going to step outside and put a bullet in him, he moved closer. The cabin was worse up close. The logs were old, rotted in places, chinked with moss and mud that had cracked and fallen away. One of the windows was boarded over with planks that didn't match the rest of the structure. The other window was intact but filthy, the glass so coated with grime that he couldn't see inside. The door hung crooked on its hinges, gap-toothed and barely functional. He stopped about 20 feet out and called, "Anyone home?" His voice sounded too loud in the stillness. No answer. He tried again. "I'm not looking for trouble, just saw your smoke." Still nothing. Ronan shifted his weight, debating. The smart move was to turn around and leave. Whoever was in there clearly didn't want company, and he wasn't in the habit of forcing himself on strangers. But something about the whole setup bothered him. The blood trail, the footprints, the collapsing cabin in the middle of nowhere. People didn't live up here unless they were running from something, and people who were running usually didn't last long. He took a step closer. The door exploded outward. Not literally. It didn't blow off the hinges or anything dramatic like that. But it swung open hard and fast, and suddenly there was a woman standing in the gap, a shotgun leveled at his chest, her eyes wild and her hands shaking so bad he could see the barrel trembling. "Don't," she said. Her voice cracked on the word. "Don't come any closer." Ronan froze. He kept his hands visible, rifle still slung across his back, palms out in a gesture that was supposed to look non-threatening, but probably just looked awkward. "Easy," he said. "I'm not here to hurt you." "Then leave." "I will. Just wanted to make sure you were all right." "I'm fine." She wasn't fine. Even from 20 feet away, Ronan could see that she was in bad shape. Her face was pale and hollow, cheekbones standing out sharp under skin that looked like it hadn't seen a decent meal in weeks. Her coat was too thin for this altitude, her boots were cracked, and the shotgun she was holding looked like it weighed more than she did. She swayed slightly as she stood there, and for a second he thought she might actually collapse. "You don't look fine," he said. Her jaw tightened. "That's not your problem." "Maybe not, but if you're planning to survive the winter up here, you're going to need more than what you've got." "I said leave." "All right." He took a step back, hands still up. "I'm going, but if you change your mind, my cabin's about 2 miles southeast. Follow the ridge down to the creek, then head upstream. You'll see the chimney smoke." She didn't respond, just stood there with the shotgun aimed at him, her breath coming out in short, ragged clouds. Ronan turned and walked away. He didn't look back, didn't need to. He could feel her eyes on him the whole way across the clearing, could feel the tension in the air like a wire pulled tight. She didn't lower the gun until he was out of sight. What? That night, back in his cabin, Ronan sat by the fire and tried to convince himself it wasn't his problem. The woman was an adult. She'd made her choice to be up here, wherever here was for her. Maybe she was running from the law. Maybe she was running from a husband. Maybe she was just one of those people who couldn't function around other human beings and needed the mountains to stay sane. Whatever her story was, it wasn't his business. He poked at the fire with a stick and watched the flames twist and curl. The problem was, he couldn't stop thinking about her face. Not because she was beautiful, though she might have been, under different circumstances, but because of the look in her eyes. That wild, desperate look that he'd seen before, in men during the war. The look of someone who'd run out of options and was just waiting for the world to finish them off. He'd seen that look in the mirror a few times too. Ronan stood and walked to the window. Outside, the snow glowed pale blue under a half moon. The trees were black silhouettes against the sky. Everything was still and frozen and perfect in the way that winter always was up here, beautiful and deadly in equal measure. He went to bed and didn't sleep much. The next morning, he loaded up a pack. He didn't make a big production of it, just grabbed some dried venison, a loaf of bread he'd baked 2 days ago, a bag of cornmeal, and a wool blanket he didn't need. He wrapped it all in oilcloth, tied it tight, and slung it over his shoulder. Then he set out toward the collapsing cabin. The snow had fallen again overnight, not much, just an inch or two, but enough to cover his tracks from yesterday. He moved quietly through the forest, taking his time, keeping an eye out for movement. When he got within 100 yards of the cabin, he stopped and waited. Watched. Listened. No smoke from the chimney today. That was bad. He approached slowly, circling wide to come at the structure from the side. The door was still closed, the windows dark. He set the pack down on a stump about 50 feet from the entrance, propped it up so it would be visible, and then turned and left. Didn't wait to see if she came out. Didn't call out to announce himself. Just left the supplies and walked away. 2 days later, the pack was gone. Ronan found the stump empty when he circled back through. No note. No sign she'd even been there except for the absence of the supplies he'd left. He stood there for a minute, looking at the bare wood, then turned and headed home. The next week, he did it again. This time he left firewood, a bundle of split pine and cedar, stacked neatly beside the stump. He also left a small tin of matches wrapped in waxed paper. He didn't stay to watch. Didn't expect thanks. The firewood was gone the next day. On his third trip, he left a rabbit he'd snared that morning, already skinned and gutted, wrapped in clean cloth. Beside it, he set a small jar of rendered fat and a handful of wild onions he'd dried last fall. That time, when he came back, he found something waiting for him on the stump. It was a small carving, rough, unfinished, but clearly deliberate. A bird, maybe a sparrow, whittled from a piece of white pine. The details were crude, but the shape was recognizable. Someone had spent time on it. Ronan picked it up and turned it over in his hands. The wood was still pale, unweathered, fresh. He slipped it into his coat pocket and walked home. But the pattern continued for 3 weeks. Ronan left food, firewood, small necessities. She took them. Sometimes she left something in return. Another carving, a bundle of dried herbs, once a small pouch of salt that must have cost her something to part with. They never spoke, never saw each other. But the exchange continued, silent and steady, like a conversation in a language neither of them had words for. It was the strangest thing Ronan had done in years. He told himself it was practical. Told himself he was just keeping her alive because it was the decent thing to do. Because letting someone freeze to death within 2 miles of his cabin would weigh on him in a way he didn't want to deal with. Told himself it didn't mean anything, but he kept the carvings, and he kept going back. Then the blizzard hit. It came out of nowhere, or at least it felt that way, even though Ronan should have seen the signs. The sky had been too clear the day before, the wind too calm. The birds had disappeared. The air had that heavy, waiting quality that always preceded a big storm. He'd ignored it. By the time the snow started falling, it was too late to do anything but batten down and ride it out. Ronan sealed the shutters, stoked the fire, and settled in with his winter stores. He had enough food to last 2 months if he rationed carefully. Enough firewood to keep the cabin warm through February. He'd weathered worse storms than this. But as the wind picked up and the snow began to fall in thick, blinding sheets, his thoughts kept drifting to the collapsing cabin 2 miles north. She wouldn't survive this. The structure was too weak. The roof was already sagging under the weight of the snow from previous storms. If the wind got bad enough, and it was going to get bad, the whole thing would come down. And even if it didn't collapse entirely, she didn't have enough firewood to keep a fire going for more than a day or two. Didn't have enough food to last a week. Didn't have the kind of insulation you needed to survive a blizzard that could last 3 or 4 days without a break. Ronan stood at the window and watched the storm build, his jaw tight. It wasn't his problem. He'd done more than most people would have done already. Left her supplies. Gave her a chance. She'd chosen to stay in that death trap of a cabin instead of coming down to his place. That was on her. The wind rattled the shutters. He turned away from the window and sat down by the fire. 5 minutes later, he was pulling on his coat. The storm was worse than he'd expected. The moment he stepped outside, the wind hit him like a fist, driving snow into his face hard enough to sting. Visibility was maybe 10 feet. The world beyond that was just white noise and chaos. He pulled his scarf up over his nose and mouth, lowered his head, and started walking. 2 miles. It should have taken him 40 minutes, maybe an hour, in good conditions. In the blizzard, it took nearly 3 hours. He got turned around twice, had to backtrack when he realized he'd drifted too far east. The cold worked its way through his coat, through his gloves, through every layer he was wearing. His fingers went numb. His face felt like leather. By the time he finally saw the dark shape of the cabin through the snow, he was shaking so hard he could barely hold the rifle. The cabin was already half buried. Snow had piled up against the walls, drifting high enough to cover the lower windows. The roof sagged dangerously in the middle, bowed under the weight. As Ronan approached, he heard a crack, loud and sharp, like a gunshot, and saw one of the support beams give way. The whole structure shuddered. He ran. The door was frozen shut. He slammed his shoulder into it once, twice, and on the third hit, it gave way, spilling him into the dark interior. Jesus Christ! The woman's voice, hoarse and panicked, came from somewhere to his left. He couldn't see her, couldn't see anything. The fire had gone out, and the only light came from the snow outside, filtering weakly through the gaps in the walls. "It's me," Ronan said, his voice rough. "From before. We need to go. Now." "I'm not—" Another crack, louder this time. The whole cabin tilted, and Ronan felt the floor shift beneath him. "There's no time," he snapped. "Move or die. Your choice." He heard her scramble in the darkness, heard the clatter of something falling, maybe the shotgun, maybe a pot. And then she was beside him, a shape darker than the shadows, moving fast. He grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the door. They made it 3 steps before the roof came down. Shut. The collapse wasn't dramatic. No explosion of splinters, no roar of timber. Just a heavy, inevitable crunch as the weight of the snow finally won and the structure folded in on itself like a house of cards. Ronan shoved the woman forward, hard, and felt something massive and solid slam into his back, driving him to the ground. Pain flared white-hot across his shoulders. He couldn't breathe, couldn't move. The world narrowed to the pressure on his spine and the sound of the woman screaming his name, except she didn't know his name, so she was just screaming, wordless and desperate. Then the pressure eased. She was pulling at the beam, her hand slipping on the snow-slick wood, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Come on, move!" Ronan pushed himself up on his elbows, dragged himself forward, and rolled clear just as another section of the roof collapsed where he'd been lying. The woman grabbed him under the arms and hauled him toward the door. She was stronger than she looked, or maybe just more desperate. They stumbled out into the blizzard. The cold hit Ronan like a second collapse. He sucked in a breath and immediately regretted it. The air was so cold it burned his lungs. The woman was still holding on to him, her grip tight enough to hurt, and he realized she was shaking worse than he was. "Come on," he said, his voice barely audible over the wind. "We have to keep moving." She didn't argue. They set off into the storm. The trip back was a nightmare. Ronan had done his best to mark the route in his mind on the way up, but in the blizzard, all his landmarks were gone. Trees that should have been distinctive were just vague shapes in the white. Ridges and gullies disappeared under the snow. The wind kept shifting direction, disorienting him, making it impossible to keep a straight line. He fell twice. The woman fell more times than he could count. Each time, they got back up. Each time, they kept moving. At some point, he lost track of how long they'd been walking. Time stopped meaning anything. There was only the storm, the cold, the endless white, and the numb, mechanical effort of putting one foot in front of the other. Then, through the snow, he saw it. A faint glow. Barely visible, just a smudge of orange in the white. His cabin. He'd left the fire burning. Ronan grabbed the woman's arm and pulled her toward the light. She stumbled, went down hard, and didn't get up. He crouched beside her and saw that her eyes were half closed, her lips blue. She was muttering something he couldn't hear. He picked her up. She was lighter than the pack he'd carried up the mountain 3 weeks ago. Light enough that it scared him. He slung her over his shoulder and staggered the last 50 yards to the cabin, kicked the door open and half carried, half dragged her inside. The warmth hit him like a wall. He set her down by the fire, stripped off her wet coat, and wrapped her in every blanket he owned. Then he collapsed beside her, his back against the wall, his chest heaving. They'd made it. Barely.
Bo sambai must.
The woman didn't wake up for 2 days. Ronan kept the fire going, kept her warm, forced water between her lips when she was conscious enough to swallow. She had frostbite on 3 fingers and both feet. He treated it the best he could, soaked her hands and feet in lukewarm water, wrapped them in clean cloth, kept them elevated. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. On the 3rd day, she opened her eyes and looked at him. "You came back," she said. Her voice was barely a whisper. Ronan, sitting by the fire with a cup of coffee, glanced over at her. "Yeah." "Why?" He didn't have a good answer for that. Didn't have any answer, really, except the truth, which was that he didn't know. So he just shrugged and said, "Seemed like the thing to do." She stared at him for a long moment, her eyes unreadable. Then she closed them again and went back to sleep. When she woke the next time, she was stronger, strong enough to sit up, strong enough to ask questions. "What's your name?" she said. "Ronan." "Ronan what?" "Hale." She nodded slowly like she was filing that away. "I'm Eliza." "Eliza what?" A pause, then, "Vance." Ronan didn't push. If she wanted to tell him more, she would. If she didn't, that was fine too. He wasn't in the habit of prying into other people's business. They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling between them. Finally, Eliza spoke. "You saved my life. You would have done the same." "No," she said quietly. "I wouldn't have." Ronan looked at her. There was something in her voice, something raw and honest, that caught him off guard. He set down his coffee and leaned back against the wall. "Why not?" he asked. Eliza didn't answer right away. She stared into the fire, her hands wrapped around the blanket, her face pale in the flickering light. When she finally spoke, her voice was so low he almost didn't hear it. "Because I'm not a good person." Ronan let that hang in the air for a moment. Then he said, "Neither am I." She looked at him, something shifting in her expression, not relief exactly, but maybe recognition, like she'd found someone who understood. "What are you running from?" he asked. Eliza's jaw tightened. For a second he thought she wasn't going to answer. Then she said, "My husband." Ronan waited. "He's not a good man," she continued. "He's powerful, connected. He works for the railroad, enforcement mostly, making sure the right people stay in line, making sure the wrong people disappear." She paused, her hands clenching in the blanket. "I found out what he did, what he's been doing, and I took something from him, something that could ruin him." "What'd you take?" She hesitated. Then she reached into the inside pocket of her coat, still drying by the fire, and pulled out a small leather journal. She held it up so he could see. "A ledger," she said. "Names, dates, payments, every bribe, every murder, every crime he's committed for the last 5 years. All of it documented." Ronan stared at the journal. "And he knows you have it?" "Yes." "So he'll come looking for you?" "Yes." "How many men?" "I don't know. As many as it takes." Ronan leaned his head back against the wall and closed his eyes. Of course. Of course she wasn't just running from a bad marriage. Of course there were killers on her trail. Of course he'd walked himself straight into the kind of mess he'd spent 6 years avoiding. "You should have told me," he said. "Would you have helped if I had?" He thought about that. Thought about the woman with the shotgun, shaking and desperate, standing in the doorway of a collapsing cabin. Thought about the choice he'd made to go back for her in the blizzard. "Yeah," he said finally. "I would have." Eliza looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Thank you." Ronan didn't respond, just stood and walked to the window, looking out at the snow. The storm had passed. The sky was clear now, pale blue and hard as glass. The mountains stretched out in every direction, white and endless and silent. Somewhere out there, men were coming. And Ronan Hale, who'd sworn off humanity 6 years ago, was about to break that promise in the worst way possible. Ronan stood at the window for a long time after Eliza stopped talking. The mountains looked different now. Not peaceful, just empty. The kind of empty that could hide anything. "How long do we have?" he asked, without turning around. "I don't know." Her voice was steadier now, but he could hear the exhaustion underneath it. "Could be days, could be weeks. Depends on how fast they figure out where I went." "And if they don't find you?" "They'll find me. They always do." Ronan turned to look at her. She was sitting up straighter now, the blankets pooled around her waist, her dark hair falling loose over her shoulders. Even half frozen and recovering from frostbite, there was something sharp about her, something that hadn't been broken yet, despite everything. "You could give them the ledger," he said. "Tell them you'll forget what you saw. Go back." Eliza's laugh was short and bitter. "You don't know my husband." "No, but I know men like him." "Then you know going back isn't an option." She looked down at her hands, at the cloth wrappings around her fingers. "He'd kill me. Maybe not right away. Maybe he'd make it look like an accident. But I'd be dead either way." Ronan crossed his arms and leaned against the wall. "So what's the plan?" Hide up here until you freeze or starve. The plan was to get to Denver, find a federal marshal, turn over the ledger and hope they can protect me long enough to testify. She paused. But the storm came early. I ran out of supplies faster than I thought. And then you showed up. Lucky me. Lucky both of us, maybe. Ronan didn't feel particularly lucky, but he didn't argue. Instead, he walked to the stove and poured himself more coffee. The pot was starting to run low. He'd need to make another batch soon, and his stores were getting thin. 2 people burned through supplies twice as fast, and he hadn't planned on feeding anyone but himself through the winter. "How much food do you have left?" Eliza asked, like she'd read his mind. "Enough for 1 person to make it to spring? Maybe. And for 2? We'd be cutting it close." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I can leave. Soon as I'm strong enough to walk, I'll go. You don't need to. You won't make it 10 miles. You don't know that." "Yeah, I do." He turned to face her, coffee cup in hand. "Your feet are frostbitten. You've got no supplies, no shelter, and no idea where you're going. You'll be dead in a week." "That's my problem." "It is. But I already dragged you out of 1 collapsing building. I'm not interested in doing it again." Eliza stared at him, her jaw tight. "Why do you care?" "I don't." The lie came out easier than he expected. "But I'm also not going to watch you walk out that door and freeze to death just so I can tell myself it's not my fault." She didn't have an answer for that. Neither did he, really. The truth was more complicated than he wanted to admit. Something about her reminded him of himself 6 years ago, running from ghosts that wouldn't stay buried. Something about the way she held that shotgun, shaking but refusing to lower it. Something about the fact that she'd carved him a bird out of pine when she had nothing else to give. He drained the coffee and set the cup down harder than he meant to. "You'll stay until you're healed. After that, we figure out the next step." "We? You got a better option?" Eliza looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she nodded once, slow and deliberate. All right, Ronan echoed. And that was that. The next 3 days passed in a strange, uneasy rhythm. Ronan kept the fire going, rationed the food, and tried not to think too hard about the fact that he was sharing his cabin with someone for the first time in 6 years. Eliza slept most of the first day, woke long enough to eat some broth and bread, then slept again. By the second day, she was moving around more, testing her feet, flexing her fingers to see how much damage the frostbite had done. "You'll lose the tips on 2 of them," Ronan said, watching her unwrap the cloth from her left hand. "Maybe 3. Which ones?" "Ring and pinky. Middle finger's a maybe." Eliza stared at her hand, her face blank. "Could be worse." "Could be." She rewrapped the cloth without saying anything else. On the 3rd day, she insisted on helping. Ronan told her to sit down and rest, but she ignored him. Instead, she started organizing the shelves, sorting through his supplies, taking stock of what they had and what they'd need. She moved slowly, favoring her feet, but she didn't complain. "You're low on flour," she said, holding up a half-empty sack. "I know. And you've only got maybe 2 weeks of dried meat left." "I know that too." "So what's the plan?" Ronan looked up from the fire, where he was roasting a rabbit he'd snared that morning. "Same plan I always have. Make it last as long as possible. Hunt when I can. Hope the snow melts early." "That's not much of a plan." "It's kept me alive this long." Eliza set the flour sack down and turned to face him. "What about trapping? You've got lines set up?" "Some. Not enough for 2 people." "Then we set up more." "We? I'm not useless, Ronan. I know how to set a snare. I know how to skin a rabbit. I grew up in the mountains. Not these mountains, but close enough." He studied her for a moment, trying to figure out if she was bluffing. She didn't look like she was. "You ever trap in winter?" "No, but I can learn." Ronan turned the rabbit on the spit, watching the fat drip into the fire. "It's harder than you think. Snow covers the trails. Animals move different. And if you make a mistake, you don't just lose the catch, you lose the trap." "Then don't let me make a mistake." He almost smiled at that. Almost. Instead, he said, "We'll start tomorrow, if you can walk that far." "I can walk." She couldn't, not really, but she tried anyway. The next morning, Ronan led her out to the nearest trap line, a 1/4 mile from the cabin, set along a game trail that ran parallel to the creek. The snow was knee-deep in places, and Eliza struggled to keep up. He could see her limping, see the way she gritted her teeth every time her weight came down on her left foot. But she didn't ask to stop, didn't complain. When they reached the first trap, Ronan crouched down and showed her how to check it without disturbing the surrounding snow. "You want to move slow," he said. "Quiet. Animals can smell you from 100 yards out. If you're clumsy, they won't come near." Eliza knelt beside him, watching closely. "What are we catching?" "Rabbits mostly. Maybe a fox if we're lucky. Pine marten if we're really lucky. And if we're unlucky? Nothing. Or a wolverine, which is worse than nothing." She glanced at him. "You ever catch a wolverine?" "Once. Lost the trap and almost lost my hand." "Noted." They moved down the line, checking each trap in turn. Most were empty. One had a rabbit, frozen stiff but intact. Ronan reset the trap and handed the rabbit to Eliza. "You carry it. Gets you used to the weight." She took it without a word. By the time they made it back to the cabin, she was shaking from exhaustion. Ronan made her sit by the fire while he skinned the rabbit and set the meat to cure. She watched him work, her eyes half closed, her breathing slow and heavy. "You did good," he said, not looking up. "I slowed you down. You kept up. That's what matters." Eliza didn't respond. When he glanced over, he saw that she'd fallen asleep sitting upright, her head tilted against the wall. Ronan shook his head and went back to work. Over the next week, they fell into a routine. Mornings, they checked the traps. Afternoons, Ronan chopped firewood while Eliza mended clothes or prepared food. Evenings, they ate in silence and sat by the fire until one of them got tired enough to sleep. It wasn't comfortable, exactly, but it worked. Eliza's feet healed slowly. The frostbite on her fingers turned black at the tips, and Ronan knew she'd lose at least part of 2 fingers when the dead tissue finally fell off. She never mentioned it, never asked him to look at them or tell her how bad it was. She just wrapped them every morning and kept moving. She was tougher than he'd given her credit for. One night, about 10 days after the blizzard, Ronan was sitting by the fire cleaning his rifle when Eliza spoke. "You ever think about leaving?" He looked up. She was sitting across from him, her knees drawn up to her chest, staring into the flames. "Leaving where?" he asked. "Here. The mountains. All of it." Ronan turned his attention back to the rifle. "No." "Not even once?" "Once, maybe. Long time ago." "What changed your mind?" He didn't answer right away. The truth was complicated, tangled up with things he didn't like to think about. The war, the things he'd done, the people he'd lost. Finally, he said, "I like it here. It's lonely." "That's the point." Eliza was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I used to think I wanted that. Quiet. Solitude. No one asking me questions or telling me what to do." She paused. "But it's different when you don't have a choice." "You always have a choice." "Not always." Ronan set the rifle down and looked at her. "You chose to take that ledger. You chose to run. You chose to stay alive when most people would have given up. And look where it got me. You're still breathing. That counts for something." Eliza met his eyes, and for a moment something passed between them. An understanding, maybe, or just a shared acknowledgement of how fragile everything really was. Then she looked away, back into the fire. "My husband used to say I was too stubborn for my own good," she said quietly. "He was probably right. He was right about a lot of things, just not the things that mattered." Ronan picked up the rifle again and resumed cleaning it. They didn't talk for the rest of the night. 2 days later, the weather turned. Ronan woke before dawn to the sound of wind battering the cabin walls. He rolled out of bed and checked the window, pulling back the shutter just enough to see outside. The sky was dark gray, heavy with clouds, and the trees were bending under the force of the wind. Snow was already starting to fall. Not the light, drifting kind, but thick and fast, driven sideways by the gusts. "Another storm?" Eliza's voice came from behind him. He turned. She was sitting up in her bedroll, her hair tangled, her face pale in the dim light. "Big one," Ronan said. "We need to secure everything, now." They spent the next hour reinforcing the shutters, stacking firewood inside the cabin, and double-checking the food stores. Ronan dragged in extra wood from the shed, enough to last 3 or 4 days if they were careful. Eliza filled every pot and bucket they had with snow, so they'd have water once the storm made it too dangerous to go outside. By mid-morning, the wind was howling so loud it sounded like the mountain itself was screaming. Ronan stood by the window watching the world disappear into white. "This one's worse than the last." "How long will it last?" Eliza asked. "No way to know. Could be 2 days, could be 5. "And if the cabin doesn't hold?" He didn't answer. There wasn't a good answer. The storm raged for 3 days. On the first day, they stayed close to the fire, rationing food and speaking only when necessary. The wind was so loud it made conversation difficult anyway. Ronan kept checking the roof, listening for the telltale crack of wood under pressure, but the cabin held, barely. On the second day, the temperature dropped. Even with the fire burning hot, the cold crept in through the gaps in the walls, through the floor, through every crack and crevice. Ronan gave Eliza the thickest blanket and told her to stay close to the stove. She didn't argue. On the third day, the wind finally started to ease. By evening, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world buried under 4 feet of fresh snow. Ronan opened the door and had to dig his way out, shoveling snow away from the entrance until he could squeeze through. The air outside was brutally cold, so cold it hurt to breathe, but the sky was clear. Stars were already starting to appear in the east. He turned to go back inside and froze. Smoke, not from his chimney, from somewhere to the south, maybe a mile away, thin and gray against the darkening sky. Ronan's chest tightened. He ducked back into the cabin and grabbed his rifle. "What is it?" Eliza asked, standing up. "Someone's out there." Her face went pale. "Are you sure?" "I saw smoke. It could be someone else. A trapper. It's not." He checked the rifle, made sure it was loaded. "Stay here. Keep the door barred." "Ronan, stay here." He didn't wait for her to argue. He stepped outside, pulled the door shut behind him, and started moving toward the smoke. The snow was deep enough that every step was a fight. Ronan kept to the tree line, using the trunks for cover, his rifle up and ready. The smoke was coming from a small clearing about a mile south, close enough that whoever made the fire could have seen his cabin if they'd been looking. He circled wide, approaching from the east, staying low. When he got close enough to see the fire, he stopped and crouched behind a fallen log. 3 men. They were standing around the fire, stamping their feet and blowing on their hands. 2 of them had rifles. The third had a shotgun slung over his shoulder. They were dressed too light for this altitude. Canvas coats and wool hats, no furs, no proper gear. They looked cold, miserable, and they were scanning the tree line like they were looking for something. Ronan's jaw tightened. He waited, watching. After a few minutes, one of the men spoke. Too far away for Ronan to make out the words, but the tone was clear, frustrated, impatient. The second man shook his head and gestured north, toward the ridge. The third man spat into the snow and said something that made the others laugh. Then they started packing up. Ronan watched as they kicked snow over the fire, shouldered their packs, and headed north. They moved like men who knew where they were going, like they had a plan. He waited until they were out of sight. Then he waited another 10 minutes to be sure. Finally, he stood and made his way back to the cabin. Eliza was waiting by the door when he came in, her face tight with worry. "Well?" 3 men, armed, heading north. Toward us? Maybe. Hard to say. She sat down heavily on the edge of the bed. "They found me." "You don't know that." "Who else would they be?" Ronan didn't have a good answer for that. He set the rifle down and started pacing. "Could be hunters. Could be trappers who got lost in the storm. Trappers don't travel in groups of 3, and they don't camp a mile from someone else's cabin without introducing themselves." She was right. Ronan stopped pacing and looked at her. "How many men does your husband have?" "Enough." "That's not an answer." Eliza rubbed her face with both hands. "I don't know. A dozen, maybe more. He hires them as he needs them. Gunslingers, enforcers, men who don't ask questions. And he'd send them all the way up here? For that ledger? Yes." Ronan swore under his breath. "We need to move." "Move where?" "We're surrounded by 10 feet of snow and it's the middle of winter. Then we defend. Against a dozen armed men? We'll die. Maybe. But if we sit here and do nothing, we'll definitely die." Eliza stared at him, her eyes wide. "You don't have to do this. You can tell them I forced you to help me. Tell them I threatened you. They'll leave you alone. Ronan shook his head. That's not how this works. Ronan, they saw the smoke from my chimney. They know someone's here. Even if I hand you over, they'll kill me anyway. Can't leave witnesses. Her face crumpled. I'm sorry. I didn't mean for... Stop. He crossed the room and sat down beside her. This isn't your fault. You didn't ask for this. And I made my choice when I went back for you in the storm. Why? Her voice was barely a whisper. Why would you do that? Ronan didn't have a good answer for that either, so he just said, because you would have done the same. Eliza looked at him, her eyes wet, and for a moment he thought she was going to cry. But she didn't. Instead, she nodded once and wiped her face with the back of her hand. All right, she said. So what do we do? Ronan stood and walked to the window. Outside, the snow glowed pale under the rising moon. The mountains were silent and still, beautiful in the way that dangerous things often were. We get ready, he said, and we wait. They spent the rest of the night preparing. Ronan pulled out every weapon he owned, 2 rifles, a shotgun, a revolver, and a hunting knife, and laid them out on the table. He checked the ammunition, counted the rounds, and tried not to think about how quickly they'd run out if things went bad. Eliza helped without being asked. She loaded the rifles, organized the bullets, and made sure everything was within easy reach. Her hands were steady now, her face calm. Whatever fear she'd felt earlier, she'd buried it. You ever been in a fight before? Ronan asked. Not like this. It's loud, confusing. People do stupid things when they're scared. I'll manage. I'm sure you will. But if it comes down to it, if they get inside, you run. You hear me? You take the ledger, and you run. Eliza looked up from the rifle she was loading. And leave you here to die? Better one of us than both. That's not happening. Eliza, I said it's not happening. Her voice was hard now, unyielding. You want to die for that ledger? Fine. But I'm not running. Not again. Ronan stared at her, trying to find the words to argue. But looking at her face, at the set of her jaw, the determination in her eyes, he knew it wouldn't matter. She'd made up her mind. Fine, he said. But stay low. And for the love of, just don't get shot. I'll do my best. They didn't sleep that night. Just sat by the fire, weapons close, listening to the wind and waiting for dawn. When the sun finally rose, pale and cold through the gray sky, Ronan stood and looked out the window. The clearing was empty. No movement, no smoke. But he could feel it, that electric tension in the air, the kind that came right before something broke. They're coming, he said quietly. Eliza stood beside him, her hand resting on the shotgun. How long? Soon. And he was right. An hour later, Ronan saw the first figure moving through the trees. The figure moved slow and deliberate through the pines, rifle in hand, scanning the tree line. Ronan could see him clearly from the window. A tall man in a dark coat, maybe 40 yards out, moving north toward the cabin. Behind him, 2 more shapes emerged from the forest. 3, Ronan said quietly. Same ones from yesterday. Eliza moved to the other window, staying low, her shotgun resting against the sill. Are they coming here? Not yet. They're circling, looking for tracks. Will they find any? Probably. I covered what I could, but the snow's too fresh. They'll see where we've been moving. The lead man stopped about 30 yards from the cabin and raised his hand. The other 2 fanned out to either side, forming a loose perimeter. They were moving like soldiers, organized, deliberate, watching each other's backs. Not random thugs. Professionals. Ronan's grip tightened on his rifle. The lead man called out, his voice carrying clear across the snow. Anyone home? Ronan didn't answer. We're just passing through, the man continued, looking for someone. A woman, dark hair, about 5.5 feet tall. You seen anyone like that? Still nothing. The man waited a few seconds, then tried again. We don't want trouble, just tell us if you've seen her and we'll be on our way. Ronan glanced at Eliza. Her face was pale but composed, her jaw set. She shook her head slightly. Don't answer. He turned back to the window. The 3 men were holding position now, rifles ready but not raised, waiting. The silence stretched out, thick and tense. Finally, the lead man sighed. All right, have it your way. He made a gesture and the other 2 started moving closer. Ronan raised his rifle and fired. The shot cracked through the morning air like a whip, and the lead man dove sideways into the snow. The bullet kicked up powder exactly where he'd been standing a second before. The other two men scattered, taking cover behind trees. "That's close enough," Ronan shouted. "Next one won't miss." There was a pause. Then the lead man's voice came from behind a thick pine. "You're making a mistake, friend. I'm not your friend, and you're on my land.
We're just looking for the woman, that's all. There's no woman here. Just me. You sure about that?" "Real sure." Another pause. Ronan could see movement between the trees, the men repositioning, trying to get a better angle on the cabin. He tracked one of them with his rifle, waiting for a clear shot. The lead man spoke again. "Her husband's offering a reward. $500 cash. All you have to do is tell us where she is." "Don't have her."
"Then you won't mind if we take a look inside?" "I mind plenty." "Listen." The man's voice took on a harder edge. "We can do this easy or we can do it hard, your choice, but either way, we're getting what we came for." Ronan fired again, this time aiming for the tree trunk where the voice was coming from. Wood exploded in a shower of splinters. Someone cursed. "That's my answer," Ronan said. For a moment, everything went quiet. Then all hell broke loose. The gunfire started from 3 directions at once. Bullets slammed into the cabin walls, punching through the shutters, shattering the glass in one of the windows. Ronan dropped below the sill and crawled toward the center of the room. Eliza was already there, pressed against the floor, her hands over her head. "You okay?" he shouted over the noise. "Fine. What do we do?" "Keep your head down." The shooting continued for maybe 30 seconds, then stopped. Ronan waited, listening. He could hear voices outside, muffled, discussing something. Planning. He crawled to the other window and peered through a gap in the shutter. One of the men was moving toward the cabin from the east, using the trees for cover. The other 2 were providing suppressing fire, keeping Ronan pinned. "They're trying to flank us," he said. Eliza grabbed the shotgun and moved to the east window. "I've got it. Wait until he's close. Make the shot count." She nodded, her face grim. The man kept coming, darting from tree to tree, getting closer with each movement. 20 yards. 15. 10. When he broke from cover to make the final dash to the cabin wall, Eliza stood and fired. The shotgun blast was deafening in the confined space. The man went down hard, clutching his leg, screaming. The other 2 immediately opened fire again, and Eliza dropped back below the window, her ears ringing. "Did I get him?" she shouted. "You got him." The wounded man was crawling back toward the trees, leaving a dark trail in the snow. His partners stopped shooting long enough to drag him into cover. Ronan used the opportunity to move to the front window and look for a target. He saw the lead man's shoulder behind a pine and fired. Missed. Fired again. The man jerked back and Ronan couldn't tell if he'd hit him or not. Then the shooting stopped again. Ronan reloaded, his hands moving on autopilot. Beside him, Eliza was doing the same with the shotgun, her face set in concentration. Her hands were shaking, but she got the shells loaded. "How many rounds do we have left?" she asked. "Enough, for now." Outside, someone was yelling. Ronan couldn't make out the words, but the tone was angry, desperate. The wounded man was probably bleeding bad, and the other 2 were trying to decide whether to keep pushing or fall back. A voice called out, not the lead man this time, but one of the others, younger. "You killed my brother!" "He's not dead," Ronan shouted back. "But he will be if you don't get him to a doctor." "You son of a—" "Take him and leave. This doesn't have to get worse." "The hell it doesn't." More gunfire. This time it was concentrated on the door, trying to blow through the wood. Ronan heard the bar crack and swore. If they kept that up, they'd breach the cabin in minutes. He grabbed the revolver from the table and moved to the door. "Eliza, cover the windows." "What are you doing?" "Ending this." Before she could argue, he lifted the bar and kicked the door open. 2 men were standing in the clearing, both with rifles aimed at the cabin. They weren't expecting the door to open. Ronan fired twice, fast. The first man went down. The second dove sideways and returned fire, but his shot went wide. Ronan stepped back and slammed the door shut, breathing hard. "Are you insane?" Eliza yelled. "Maybe. You could have been killed." "But I wasn't." She stared at him like he'd lost his mind. Maybe he had. But now there were only 2 men left standing, and one of them was wounded. The odds were getting better. Outside, someone was screaming in pain.
not the wounded man from before, the one Ronan had just shot. The sound cut off abruptly, and then there was silence.
Ronan moved back to the window and looked out. The clearing was empty except for the body. No sign of the other two. They'd pulled back into the trees.
"Where are they?"
Eliza whispered. "Regrouping. Or retreating. You think they'll leave?" "No." She swore softly. "So what now?" "We wait. See what they do next." They waited. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. The silence was worse than the gunfire. At least when they were shooting, Ronan knew where they were. Now they could be anywhere, setting up an ambush, circling around to the back of the cabin, preparing to burn them out. Ronan kept his rifle trained on the tree line, his eyes scanning for movement. Beside him, Eliza did the same. Then he heard it. A faint crackling sound like dry wood catching fire. He turned and saw smoke seeping through the gaps in the back wall. "They're burning us out," he said. Eliza ran to the back of the cabin and pressed her hand against the wall. It was hot. What do we do? Ronan's mind raced. If they stayed inside, they'd suffocate or burn. If they went outside, they'd be sitting targets. There was no good option. "We go out the front," he said, "fast and low. Make for the trees." "They'll be waiting for us." "I know." Eliza stared at him, her eyes wide. Then she nodded. "All right." Ronan grabbed the rifle and moved to the door. The smoke was getting thicker now, filling the cabin, making his eyes water. He could hear the fire crackling louder, eating through the back wall. "On 3, he said. 1, 2. The door exploded inward. Not from gunfire, from a man's shoulder, slamming into the wood with enough force to tear it off its hinges. Ronan stumbled back, raising his rifle. But the man was already on him, big, fast, swinging a club that caught Ronan across the side of the head. Pain exploded white and hot. Ronan went down hard, his vision swimming. Through the haze, he saw the man raise the club again. Then Eliza was there, the shotgun in her hands, and she pulled the trigger. The blast caught the man in the chest and threw him backward through the doorway. He hit the snow and didn't move. Eliza dropped the shotgun and grabbed Ronan's arm. "Get up. We have to go." He let her pull him to his feet, his head spinning. Blood was running down the side of his face, warm and sticky. He wiped it away and grabbed his rifle. The cabin was burning now, flames licking up the back wall, black smoke pouring through the door. They had maybe a minute before the whole structure went up. "Go," Ronan said, pushing Eliza toward the door. She hesitated. The ledger, "Forget it. Move!" They ran. Outside, the clearing was chaos. The man Eliza had shot was sprawled in the doorway, blood spreading dark across the snow. The body from earlier was still lying where it had fallen, and standing at the edge of the trees, rifle raised, was the lead man. He fired. The bullet caught Ronan in the shoulder, spinning him around. He hit the ground hard, gasping, his rifle flying from his hands. Pain radiated down his arm, sharp and burning. Eliza screamed his name and fired the revolver, once, twice, 3 times. The shots went wild, but they were close enough to make the man duck back behind a tree. She ran to Ronan and grabbed him under the arms. "Come on, get up." "Go," he said through gritted teeth. "Leave me." "Shut up." She hauled him to his feet and half carried, half dragged him toward the trees. Behind them, the cabin groaned and collapsed inward, sending up a shower of sparks and ash. They made it to the tree line just as another shot rang out. The bullet hit a trunk inches from Eliza's head, and she flinched but didn't stop. She kept moving, pulling Ronan deeper into the forest, away from the burning cabin, away from the gunfire. They stumbled through the snow for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Finally, when Ronan's legs gave out completely, Eliza lowered him against a tree and collapsed beside him. They were both breathing hard, their breath coming out in ragged white clouds. Ronan's shoulder was on fire, blood soaking through his coat. Eliza's hands were shaking so bad she could barely hold the revolver. "Let me see," she said, reaching for his shoulder. "It's fine." "It's not fine. You're bleeding." "I've had worse." "That doesn't make it fine." She pulled his coat aside and hissed when she saw the wound. The bullet had gone through the meat of his shoulder, missing bone, but tearing through muscle. Blood was still flowing, dark and steady. "We need to stop the bleeding," she said. "No time. They're still out there." "Ronan, later. We need to move." He tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't cooperate. Eliza grabbed his good arm and helped him up, and together they started moving again. Behind them, through the trees, Ronan could hear voices. The men were following. They moved as fast as they could, which wasn't fast at all. Ronan's shoulder throbbed with every step, and the blood loss was starting to make him lightheaded. Eliza kept one arm around his waist, supporting his weight, her face grim with determination. After a while, the voices faded. Either the men had lost their trail, or they decided to regroup. Either way, it bought them time. They found a small hollow beneath an overhanging rock and stopped to rest. Ronan slumped against the stone, his vision blurring at the edges. Eliza tore a strip from her shirt and wrapped it around his shoulder, pulling it tight to slow the bleeding. "That's going to need stitches," she said. "Later." "You keep saying that." "Because it's true." She tied off the makeshift bandage and sat back, her hands covered in his blood. "We lost everything. The cabin, the supplies, all of it. We're alive. That's what matters." "For how long? You're hurt. We're out in the open and they're still hunting us." Ronan closed his eyes and leaned his head back against the rock. She was right. They were in bad shape. No food, no shelter. Winter all around them. And somewhere in the forest, at least one armed man was still looking for them. "The ledger," he said suddenly. "Did you grab it?" Eliza reached into her coat and pulled out the small leather journal, slightly singed at the edges but intact. "I got it. Good." "Was it worth it? All of this?" Ronan opened his eyes and looked at her. Her face was streaked with soot and blood, her hair tangled, her eyes red from smoke. But she was still here, still fighting. "Yeah," he said. "It was." She stared at him for a long moment, then looked away. "You're an idiot." "Probably." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the wind and the distant creak of the trees. Ronan's shoulder hurt like hell, but the bleeding had slowed. That was something. Finally, Eliza spoke. "What do we do now?" "We keep moving. Head east toward the lower valleys. Find a town. Get you to a federal marshal." "That's days away. Maybe weeks." "You got a better plan?" She didn't answer. Ronan pushed himself upright, gritting his teeth against the pain. "Come on. We need to put more distance between us and them." Eliza stood and helped him up. Together they stepped out of the hollow and back into the snow. They walked for hours, following game trails and ridgelines, staying under cover as much as possible. The sun climbed higher, then started to sink again. Ronan's legs felt like lead, and his shoulder had gone from burning to a dull, constant ache that made it hard to think straight. Eliza was in better shape, but not by much. Her frostbitten feet were slowing her down, and she was limping badly by mid-afternoon. "We need to stop," she said finally. "Not yet." "Ronan, you can barely stand. I can stand fine." "You're leaning on me so hard I'm about to fall over." He looked down and realized she was right. He'd been putting most of his weight on her without even realizing it. "Sorry," he muttered. "Don't apologize. Just stop." They found a cluster of pines with branches low enough to provide some cover and collapsed beneath them. Ronan sat with his back against a trunk, his breathing labored. Eliza knelt beside him and checked his shoulder again. "It's still bleeding," she said. "Not much." "Enough." She rewrapped the bandage, pulling it tighter. Ronan hissed through his teeth, but didn't complain. When she was done, she sat back and looked at him. "You're going to die if we don't get that stitched soon." "I'm not going to die." "You don't know that. I've survived worse." "You keep saying that too." Ronan managed a weak smile. "Because it keeps being true." Eliza didn't smile back. She just stared at him, her face unreadable. Then she said, "Why are you doing this?" "Doing what?" "Risking your life for someone you barely know. I told you, they would have killed me anyway." "That's not the only reason." He looked away, out at the snow. "Maybe not." "Then what is it?" Ronan was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, 6 years ago, I walked away from everything. The war, my family, the whole damn world. I told myself I was done, that I didn't owe anyone anything, and no one owed me. And for a while that worked." He paused, trying to find the right words. "Then you showed up, and I could have walked away again, could have left you in that cabin to freeze, could have told those men where you were and saved myself the trouble. But I didn't." "Why not?"
Because I'm tired of walking away. Eliza stared at him, her eyes glistening. That's the stupidest reason I've ever heard. Probably. You're going to get yourself killed. Maybe. She shook her head, but there was something in her expression, something soft, almost grateful. Thank you, she said quietly. Don't thank me yet. We're not out of this. I know, but still, thank you. Ronan nodded. He didn't trust himself to say anything else. They rested for another hour, then started moving again. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. It would have been beautiful if they weren't running for their lives. As darkness fell, they heard it, the crack of a branch, the crunch of snow under boots. Someone was following them. Ronan stopped and turned, his good hand on the revolver. Eliza pressed close beside him, her breathing shallow. Through the trees, maybe 50 yards back, he saw movement, a figure, dark against the snow, moving slow and careful. Just one, Ronan whispered. The lead man? Probably. What do we do? Ronan looked around. They were in open forest now, no cover, no good place to make a stand. If the man got close enough for a clear shot, they were done. We run, he said. You can't run. Watch me. They took off through the trees, stumbling over roots and rocks hidden beneath the snow. Ronan's shoulder screamed with every jarring step, but he kept moving. Behind them, he could hear the man crashing through the underbrush, closing the distance. A shot rang out. The bullet hit a tree to their right, spraying bark. Eliza grabbed Ronan's arm and pulled him left, down a slope, toward a frozen creek bed. They slid down the embankment and landed hard at the bottom. Ronan's vision went white with pain, but he forced himself to keep moving. They ran along the creek bed, their boots crunching on the ice. Another shot. This one went wide. Then Ronan's foot went through the ice. He went down hard, his leg plunging into the freezing water up to his knee. He tried to pull himself out, but his strength was gone. The cold water hit him like a punch, stealing what little warmth he had left. Eliza grabbed him under the arms and hauled him onto solid ice. Come on, get up. Go, he said. Leave me. Not happening. She pulled him to his feet and they kept moving, but Ronan knew it was over. His leg was soaked, already going numb. In this cold, he had maybe an hour before frostbite set in. Maybe less. The man appeared at the top of the embankment, silhouetted against the darkening sky. He raised his rifle. Eliza turned and fired the revolver. The shot was wild, but it made the man duck. She fired again. Click. Empty. The man stood and took aim. Ronan pushed Eliza behind him and raised his own revolver with his good hand. His vision was swimming, his hand shaking, but he steadied his breath and squeezed the trigger. The shot echoed across the frozen creek. The man staggered, clutched his side, and fell backward out of sight. For a moment, everything was silent. Then Eliza was pulling Ronan forward again, away from the creek, into the trees. He didn't know how long they walked. Could have been minutes. Could have been hours. Everything was starting to blur together. The cold, the pain, the exhaustion. Finally, his legs gave out completely, and he collapsed in the snow. Eliza knelt beside him, her face pale. Ronan, stay with me. Tired, he mumbled. I know, but you can't sleep, not yet. Just for a minute. No, Ronan, look at me. He forced his eyes open. She was leaning over him, her hands on his face, her expression fierce. You don't get to die, she said. Not after everything. You hear me? You don't get to die. Okay, he whispered. Promise me. I promise. She pulled off her coat and wrapped it around him, even though she was shivering herself. Then she sat beside him and pulled his head onto her lap, holding him close. We're going to make it, she said, her voice breaking. Both of us. We're going to make it. Ronan wanted to believe her, but as the darkness closed in around him, he wasn't sure he'd wake up to find out. Ronan woke to pain. Not the sharp, bright kind that came with fresh wounds, but the deep, grinding ache that meant his body had been working overtime just to keep him breathing. His shoulder throbbed. His leg felt like it was encased in ice, and his head pounded with a rhythm that matched his heartbeat. He opened his eyes and saw a gray sky through pine branches. You're awake. Eliza's voice came from somewhere to his left. He turned his head, slowly, because even that hurt, and saw her sitting against a tree,
her face drawn and pale. She'd wrapped herself in both their coats, but she was still shivering. "How long was I out?" he asked. His voice came out raspy, barely recognizable. "Most of the night. It's morning now, maybe 8 o'clock. Ronan tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. The world tilted sideways, and for a second he thought he might pass out again.
Easy, Eliza said, moving to his side. Don't push it. We need to move. You need to rest. Can't rest, they're still out there. The one you shot is dead, I checked. Ronan blinked at her. You went back? Just far enough to see. He bled out in the snow. She paused. That leaves 2. Maybe. The one I shot in the leg might not have made it either. Or he did, and now they're both looking for us.
Eliza didn't argue with that. She just pulled the coats tighter around herself and stared out at the trees. Ronan forced himself into a sitting position, breathing hard from the effort. His leg was still wet, the fabric frozen stiff against his skin. He could barely feel his toes. That was bad. That was very bad. "We need fire," he said. "I know, but if we make a fire, they'll see the smoke. If we don't make a fire, I'll lose the leg." Eliza looked at him, her expression torn. Finally, she nodded. "All right, but just for a little while. Just enough to get you warm." She gathered what dry wood she could find. Not much, but enough for a small fire. She used the matches from Ronan's coat pocket, the ones that had somehow survived everything, and coaxed the flames to life. The heat was immediate and glorious, spreading through Ronan's body like medicine. He pulled off his boot and peeled away the frozen fabric of his pants leg. His skin was white and waxy, the kind of color that meant frostbite had already started. He held his foot close to the fire, gritting his teeth against the pins and needles sensation as feeling slowly returned. Eliza tended to his shoulder while the fire burned, unwrapping the blood-soaked bandage and cleaning the wound as best she could with snow. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. "You're going to have a hell of a scar," she said. "Add it to the collection." She almost smiled at that. Almost. Instead, she tore another strip from her shirt, which was getting pretty threadbare at this point, and wrapped his shoulder again, pulling the fabric tight. When she was done, she sat back and looked at him. "We can't keep doing this." "Doing what?" "Running, bleeding, barely surviving." She gestured at the fire, at his shoulder, at the frozen wasteland around them. "We're not going to make it to Denver like this. So what do you suggest?" "I don't know, but this isn't working." Ronan stared into the fire, watching the flames dance. She was right. They were running on fumes, and every hour they stayed out here was another chance for the cold or the wounds or the men hunting them to finish the job. "There's a mining camp," he said finally, "about 15 miles east of here. Might be abandoned by now, but it's shelter. And if we're lucky, there might be supplies left behind." 15 miles in your condition? "You got a better option?" Eliza was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "No?" "Then that's where we go." They killed the fire after 20 minutes, burying the embers under snow and scattering the wood. It wasn't perfect, but it would have to do. Ronan pulled his frozen boot back on and tested his weight on the leg. It hurt, but it held. That was something. They set off east, moving slow and careful. Ronan used a broken branch as a makeshift crutch, taking the weight off his bad leg as much as he could. Eliza stayed close, ready to catch him if he fell. The morning dragged on. The sun climbed higher but offered no warmth, just pale light that reflected off the snow until everything hurt to look at. They didn't talk much. Talking required energy they didn't have. Around midday they stopped to rest. Ronan's shoulder was bleeding again, a slow seep that darkened the bandage. Eliza checked it and frowned. "We need to stitch this," she said. "Not here." "Ronan, when we get to the camp, not before." She looked like she wanted to argue, but she didn't, just helped him back to his feet, and they kept moving. By mid-afternoon, Ronan's vision was starting to blur again. The blood loss, combined with the cold and the lack of food, was catching up to him. He stumbled more than once, and each time Eliza caught him and hauled him upright. "How much further?" she asked. 3 miles, maybe 4. "You said 15. We've been walking for hours." "Not that fast." Ronan didn't have the energy to argue. He just kept putting one foot in front of the other, leaning heavy on the makeshift crutch, focusing on the next step and nothing else. As the sun started to sink toward the horizon, they crested a ridge and saw it.
a cluster of rough structures huddled in a narrow valley. The mining camp. Some of the buildings had collapsed under the weight of previous winters, but a few still stood, dark and silent, against the snow. There, Ronan said, pointing. Eliza stared at the camp, then at him. Can you make it? I'll make it. It took another hour to reach the camp. By the time they stumbled into the valley, the sun was almost gone, and the temperature was dropping fast. Ronan's teeth were chattering so hard he could barely speak. They tried the first building. The door was hanging off its hinges, and inside was just rubble and debris. The second building was in better shape. 4 walls and most of a roof, with a stone fireplace that looked like it might still work. This one, Eliza said. Ronan didn't argue. He collapsed against the wall while Eliza searched for anything useful. She found a rusted shovel, some broken crates, and half a bag of salt that had turned into a solid brick. Not much, but the crates would burn. She broke up the wood and built a fire in the fireplace. It took a while to catch. The wood was damp and rotted, but eventually the flames took hold. Warmth started to fill the small space. Ronan closed his eyes and let the heat wash over him. You need to eat something, Eliza said. We don't have anything. We have this. She pulled a small bundle from her coat, dried venison that Ronan had put in his pocket days ago and forgotten about. It was frozen solid, but it was food. She held it over the fire until it thawed, then handed half to Ronan. Tasted like leather and salt, but he chewed it anyway. His stomach cramped almost immediately, unused to anything solid after days of nothing. When they'd finished eating, Eliza unwrapped his shoulder again. The wound looked worse in the firelight, swollen and angry, the edges starting to turn dark. This needs to be stitched, she said. Now. We don't have needle or thread. Then we improvise. She searched the building and came back with a piece of thin wire and what looked like fishing line. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than nothing. This is going to hurt, she said. I know. Eliza heated the wire in the fire until it glowed red, then let it cool just enough to handle. She threaded the fishing line through the end and looked at Ronan. Ready? No, do it anyway. She worked fast, pushing the wire through his skin and pulling the edges of the wound together with the line. Ronan gritted his teeth and stared at the ceiling, counting the cracks in the wood, focusing on anything except the feeling of metal piercing his flesh over and over. It took maybe 10 minutes, but it felt like hours. When she was done, she tied off the line and sat back, her hands shaking. That's the best I can do. It's enough. She wrapped the shoulder again with a cleaner piece of cloth she'd found in the ruins, then collapsed beside him, exhausted. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the fire crackle. Finally, Ronan spoke. Thank you. For what? For not leaving me. Eliza looked at him, her face half in shadow. You didn't leave me. That was different. How? I had a choice. You didn't. I had a choice, she said quietly. I could have kept running, left you in the snow, saved myself. Why didn't you? She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, because I'm tired of running alone. Ronan felt something shift in his chest, something he hadn't felt in a long time. He reached out and took her hand. Her fingers were cold and rough, the tips still black from frostbite, but she squeezed back. They fell asleep like that, sitting against the wall, hands clasped, the fire burning low between them. Ronan woke sometime in the night to the sound of voices outside. He opened his eyes and saw Eliza already awake, staring at the door, her hand on the revolver. The fire had burned down to embers, casting barely any light. The voices were distant, maybe 100 yards away. 2 men, arguing about something. Ronan couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clear. They were searching the camp. How many rounds do we have left? He whispered. Eliza checked the revolver. 3. That's it? That's it, Ronan swore under his breath. 3 bullets against 2 armed men. The odds weren't good. The voices were getting closer. We need to hide, Eliza said. Where? This is one room. She looked around frantically, then pointed to a section of collapsed roof in the corner. There, under the rubble. They'll see us. You have a better idea? He didn't. They crawled across the floor and burrowed into the rubble, pulling broken boards and debris over themselves. It wasn't much cover,
but in the darkness, it might be enough. The voices stopped right outside the building. "You check this one?" a man's voice said. "Not yet. Looks empty." "Check it anyway." Footsteps, the creak of the door being pushed open. Through a gap in the boards, Ronan could see a figure silhouetted in the doorway, holding a lantern. The man stepped inside, his boots crunching on the debris. "Anyone here?" he called out. Silence. The man walked to the fireplace and crouched down, studying the embers. He reached out and touched them, then pulled his hand back. "Still warm," he said. "They're close." Another figure appeared in the doorway. How close? Could be minutes, could be hours, but they were here. The second man stepped inside. In the lantern light, Ronan could see his face, hard, weathered, with a scar running from his temple to his jaw. This was the lead man, the one who'd been hunting them from the start. "Check the back rooms," the scarred man said. There are no back rooms." "Then check outside, look for tracks." The first man left. The scarred man stayed, walking slowly around the room, his eyes scanning every corner. He stopped near the pile of rubble where Ronan and Eliza were hiding. Ronan held his breath. The man stood there for what felt like forever, just looking. Then he turned and walked to the door. "Nothing here?" he called out. "Let's keep moving." The footsteps faded. Ronan and Eliza stayed hidden for another 10 minutes, listening. When they were sure the men were gone, they crawled out of the rubble, covered in dust and splinters. "That was too close," Eliza whispered. "Yeah. They're not giving up." "No." "So what do we do?" Ronan looked at her, then at the dying embers in the fireplace. An idea was forming, reckless, probably stupid, but it might be their only shot. "We stop running," he said. "What?" "They're hunting us, wearing us down, waiting for us to make a mistake." He met her eyes. "So we turn it around. We hunt them." Eliza stared at him like he'd lost his mind. "Hunt them?" "Ronan, you can barely walk. We have 3 bullets. They have... I know what they have, but they think we're running scared. They think we're weak. We use that." "How?" "We set a trap." She was quiet for a moment, considering. Then she said, "What kind of trap?" Ronan explained his plan. It wasn't complicated, but it didn't need to be. Simple plans were harder to screw up. When he finished, Eliza shook her head. "This is insane." "You got a better idea?" "No, but that doesn't make this any less insane." "So we do it?" She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "We do it." They spent the next hour preparing. Ronan couldn't move fast, but he could still think, and Eliza could handle the heavy work. They gathered what they needed from the ruins: rope from an old mining cart, boards from the collapsed buildings, anything that could be used. By the time they were done, the sun was starting to rise, painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold. "They'll come back," Ronan said. "Probably this morning. They know we're close." "And when they do?" "We'll be ready." They took positions on opposite sides of the building, Ronan near the door, Eliza in the back corner where she had a clear line of sight. The trap was set. Now all they had to do was wait. The sun climbed higher. An hour passed, then 2. Ronan's shoulder was on fire, and his leg had gone numb again. He shifted his weight, trying to stay alert, but exhaustion was pulling at him like a current. Then he heard it. Footsteps in the snow, coming from the north. He glanced at Eliza. She nodded. "Ready." The door creaked open. The first man stepped inside, cautious, his rifle raised. He took 2 steps, then 3. His eyes scanned the room, looking for movement. He didn't see the rope until it was too late. His foot caught the tripwire, and the makeshift deadfall, a heavy beam balanced precariously above the door, came crashing down. It caught him across the shoulders and drove him to the ground. His rifle went flying. Ronan was on him in a second, his good hand wrapped around the man's throat, pressing hard. The man struggled, clawing at Ronan's arm, but he was pinned under the beam and couldn't get leverage. "Where's the other one?" Ronan growled. The man gasped for air, his face turning red. "Go to hell." Ronan pressed harder. "Where?" A gunshot cracked through the air. Ronan felt the bullet pass inches from his head and threw himself sideways. The scarred man was standing in the doorway, rifle aimed, his face twisted in fury. He fired again. This time the bullet hit the wall behind Ronan, spraying splinters. Eliza stood from her position in the corner and fired the revolver. The shot caught the scarred man in the leg, and he went down hard, cursing. Ronan scrambled to his feet and grabbed the fallen rifle. He aimed it at the scarred man who was trying to raise his own weapon. "Don't," Ronan said. The scarred man hesitated, then lowered the rifle. Blood was spreading dark across his pants leg. "It's over," Ronan said. "Your men are dead. You're bleeding. You've lost." The scarred man laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "You think this is over? You think killing me changes anything?" "It changes enough. Her husband will send more men, and more after that. You can't run forever." "We're not running anymore." The scarred man's expression shifted, something like respect flickering across his face. Then he lunged for his rifle. Eliza fired. The bullet caught him in the chest, and he fell back against the doorframe, his eyes going wide. He tried to speak, but only blood came out. Then he slumped forward and didn't move. The other man, still pinned under the beam, had stopped struggling. Ronan walked over and checked his pulse. Nothing. It was done. Ronan lowered the rifle and turned to Eliza. She was standing frozen, the revolver still raised, her face pale. "You okay?" he asked. "I killed him." "You didn't have a choice." "I know, but Her voice broke. "I killed him." Ronan crossed the room and gently took the revolver from her hand. "Hey, look at me." She did, her eyes wide and wet. "You saved my life," he said. "Again. That's all this was." "It doesn't feel like that." "It never does." "But it's true." She nodded slowly, then collapsed against him, her body shaking. Ronan put his good arm around her and held her while she cried. After a while, she pulled back and wiped her face. "What now?" "Now we finish this. We get to Denver, turn over the ledger, end it for real." "How? We don't have supplies. We don't have horses. We're barely—" "They do." Ronan gestured to the dead men. "Check their packs, see what they've got." Eliza searched the bodies while Ronan kept watch. She came back with 2 rifles, ammunition, dried food, blankets, and most importantly, a map. Ronan spread the map on the floor and studied it. "There's a town about 30 miles southeast, Ridgeway. From there we can catch a stage to Denver." 30 miles? "It's downhill most of the way, and we've got supplies now. We can make it." Eliza looked at him, doubt written all over her face. But she nodded. "All right, let's go." They left the mining camp behind and started the long walk toward civilization. The first 2 days were the hardest. Ronan's shoulder screamed with every step, and his leg alternated between numb and burning. But the supplies from the dead men made all the difference. They had food now, real food, not just scraps. They had blankets. They had ammunition. And most importantly, they had hope. Eliza walked beside him, quiet but watchful. She'd changed since the mining camp. Something had hardened in her, like metal tempered in fire. She didn't flinch at shadows anymore, didn't look over her shoulder every 5 minutes. She just kept moving forward. On the 3rd day, they crested a ridge and saw smoke in the distance. Not the thin, desperate smoke of a campfire, but thick columns rising from chimneys. Civilization. "Ridgeway," Ronan said, pointing. Eliza stared at the town like it was a mirage. "We made it." "Not yet. Still got to get down there." The descent took another 3 hours. By the time they stumbled into the edge of town, the sun was setting and Ronan could barely stand. His vision kept blurring at the edges, and his shoulder had started bleeding again despite Eliza's stitches. The town was bigger than Ronan had expected. Maybe 300 people, with a main street lined with storefronts and a decent-sized hotel. People stopped and stared as they walked past. 2 strangers covered in blood and dirt, armed to the teeth, moving like ghosts. "We need a doctor," Eliza said. "We need the law first." "Ronan, you're about to pass out." "I'll manage." She grabbed his arm and forced him to stop. "No, you won't. We're finding a doctor. Now." He wanted to argue, but his legs chose that moment to give out. Eliza caught him before he hit the ground and called out to a man standing outside the general store. "Where's the doctor?" The man pointed down the street. "3rd building on the left, but he's—" "Thanks." She half-carried, half-dragged Ronan down the street and up the steps of a small white building with a sign that read Dr. Coleman, Physician. She pounded on the door until it opened. An older man with gray hair and spectacles looked them up and down, his expression shifting from annoyed to alarmed. What in the... He's been shot, Eliza said. 3 days ago. He needs help. The doctor stepped aside. Get him inside. The next few hours were a blur. Ronan remembered being laid out on a table, remembered the doctor cutting away the makeshift bandage and swearing under his breath, remembered the sharp bite of a needle and the smell of carbolic acid. Then nothing. When he woke, it was dark outside. He was lying in a bed, an actual bed, with clean sheets, in a small room that smelled like medicine and soap. His shoulder was wrapped in proper bandages, and his leg was elevated on a pillow. Eliza was sitting in a chair beside the bed, her head tilted back against the wall, asleep. She'd cleaned up, washed her face, combed her hair, but she still looked exhausted. Ronan tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. The pain in his shoulder flared bright and hot. Eliza's eyes snapped open. Don't move. How long was I out? About 6 hours. Doctor said you lost a lot of blood. Said it's a miracle you made it this far. Where's the ledger? She patted her coat. Right here, safe. Ronan relaxed back against the pillow. We need to find a federal marshal. Already did. He's coming by in the morning. How'd you manage that? Told him I had information about corruption in the railroad. He was very interested. I bet. Eliza leaned forward, her expression serious. Ronan, there's something you need to know. The doctor said your shoulder will heal, but it's going to take time. Weeks, maybe months. And there's a good chance you won't get full use of it back. I figured as much. I'm sorry. Don't be. I'm alive. That's more than I expected a week ago. She looked at him for a long moment, then reached out and took his hand. Thank you for everything. We already did this conversation. I know, but I mean it. You saved my life more times than I can count, and you didn't have to. You could have turned me in, could have saved yourself. So could you. That's different. How? She smiled faintly. Because I'm stubborn. So am I. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, hands still clasped. Finally, Eliza spoke again. What are you going to do after all this is over? Ronan hadn't thought that far ahead. His whole world for the past week had been survival, getting through the next hour, the next day. The idea of a future beyond that felt strange, distant. Don't know, he said finally. Guess I'll figure it out. You could come with me to Denver, start over. Denver's not really my kind of place. What is your kind of place? He thought about the cabin, the one that had burned to the ground. Thought about 6 years of solitude, of telling himself he was better off alone. Thought about how quickly that had fallen apart the moment he'd met a woman with a shotgun and nowhere to go. I don't know anymore, he admitted. Eliza squeezed his hand. Well, you've got time to figure it out. The federal marshal arrived the next morning, a stern-faced man named Crawford, with iron gray hair and a badge that looked like it had seen better days. He sat across from Eliza in the doctor's front room while Ronan listened from the bed in the back. You're telling me your husband orchestrated the robbery of a federal payroll train, Crawford said, his voice skeptical. I'm telling you he's been orchestrating robberies, bribes, and murders for the past 5 years, Eliza replied, and I have proof. She set the ledger on the table. Crawford opened it and started reading. His expression didn't change for the first few pages. Then his eyebrows went up. Then he started swearing under his breath. After 10 minutes, he closed the book and looked at Eliza. Where did you get this? From my husband's office. He kept it locked in a safe. Thought no one would ever find it. And you're willing to testify? Yes. Crawford leaned back in his chair, studying her. You know what you're asking for, don't you? Your husband has connections, money, power. This kind of testimony could get you killed. People have already tried to kill me, multiple times. I'm still here. The marshal glanced toward the back room where Ronan was lying. I heard about the men who came after you. Sheriff found 3 bodies up in the mountains. Another 2 at an abandoned mining camp. Self-defense, Eliza said flatly. I believe you. But that doesn't make this any easier. If we're going to take down someone like your husband, we need to do it right. That means federal prosecutors. That means Denver. And that means you're going to be in protective custody until this goes to trial. How long? Could be weeks. Could be months. Eliza was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded.
All right, but I want him there. She pointed toward the back room. Ronan Hale. He gets protection too. Ma'am, I appreciate what he's done for you, but federal protection is for witnesses, not... He's a witness. He saw the men my husband sent. He fought them off. He knows everything I know. Crawford sighed. Fine, but he's in no shape to travel. We'll have to wait until the doctor clears him. That's fine. The marshal stood and tucked the ledger under his arm. I'll wire Denver today. Get this process started. But Miss Vance... He paused at the door. You better be telling the truth about all this, because if you're not, you're going to federal prison right alongside your husband. I'm telling the truth. Crawford nodded and left. Eliza walked back to Ronan's room and sat down heavily in the chair. That went better than I expected. He believes you. For now, but he's right. This is going to get ugly. You can still walk away. No, I can't. Not anymore. She looked at him, her eyes hard. I tried walking away once. Tried hiding. Tried pretending none of it was real, and all it did was get people killed. I'm done running. Ronan recognized that look. He'd seen it in the mirror plenty of times. The look of someone who'd crossed a line they couldn't uncross. Who'd made a choice that changed everything. All right, he said. Then we see it through. It took 2 weeks for Ronan to heal enough to travel. The doctor was cautious, checking his shoulder every day, watching for signs of infection. The stitches held and the wound started to close, but it was slow going. During that time, Marshal Crawford came by twice more, asking questions, taking statements, building his case. He brought news from Denver. Arrest warrants had been issued for Eliza's husband and 3 of his associates. Federal marshals were already moving to bring them in. It's happening, Crawford said on his second visit. Slowly, but it's happening. How long until trial? Eliza asked. 3 months, maybe 4. We need to gather witnesses, compile evidence, make sure everything's airtight. And in the meantime, you stay safe. Stay out of sight, and you let us handle this. After he left, Eliza turned to Ronan. 3 months. Could be worse. Could be better. You having second thoughts? No, just tired of waiting. Ronan understood that. Waiting was harder than running sometimes. At least when you were running, you had something to do. Something to focus on besides the fear and the doubt. On the 15th day, the doctor finally cleared Ronan to travel. His shoulder was still stiff, and he couldn't raise his arm above his head, but the infection risk had passed. That was good enough. Marshal Crawford arrived the next morning with 2 other marshals and a covered wagon. We leave in an hour, he said. Pack light. And stay armed. The journey to Denver took 4 days. They traveled during daylight hours only, staying on main roads, avoiding anything that looked like an ambush site. The marshals were professional and cautious, always watching the tree line, always ready for trouble. It never came. Ronan spent most of the trip watching the landscape change as they descended from the mountains into the plains. The snow gave way to brown grass and bare earth. The air got warmer. The sky got wider. Eliza sat beside him in the wagon, quiet and tense. She'd pulled the ledger out twice to read through it, like she was memorizing every detail, like she was preparing for battle. On the 4th day, they crested a rise and saw Denver spread out below them, bigger and louder and more chaotic than anything Ronan had seen in 6 years. Welcome back to civilization, Crawford said from the driver's seat. Ronan wasn't sure civilization was the right word, but he didn't argue. They were taken to a federal building in the center of town, a 3-story brick structure with armed guards at every entrance. Crawford led them to a suite of rooms on the 2nd floor. You'll stay here until the trial, he said. Guards outside at all times. No one comes in or out without my permission. How long? Eliza asked. Couple of months, like I said. Maybe less if we can expedite things. After Crawford left, Eliza walked to the window and stared out at the city. 2 months in a room. After everything we've been through, we're going to be stuck in a room. Could be worse. You keep saying that. Because it keeps being true. She turned to look at him. Are you always this optimistic? No. Usually I'm worse. That got a small smile out of her. Just a flicker, but it was there. The weeks that followed settled into a strange routine. Marshals came and went, asking questions, taking statements, preparing for trial. Lawyers showed up with thick folders and talked in language Ronan barely understood.
Eliza spent hours going through the ledger with prosecutors, explaining every entry, every name, every crime. Ronan, for his part, tried to stay useful. He gave a statement about the men who'd come after them, described the fights, the ambushes, the mining camp. The prosecutors listened and took notes, but he could tell they were more interested in Eliza's testimony than his. That was fine. This was her fight, not his. One evening, about 6 weeks into their stay, Eliza came back from a meeting with the prosecutors looking worn down. She collapsed into a chair and rubbed her face. "They want me to testify about our marriage," she said. "What about it?" "Everything. How he treated me, what he said, what he did." She paused. "They want to paint him as a monster, and they're not wrong, but it's going to mean dragging out every horrible thing that happened over the past 10 years. Ronan sat down across from her. "You don't have to do it." "Yes, I do. If I don't, he walks. And if he walks, all of this was for nothing." "It wasn't for nothing, wasn't it? We lost everything, your cabin, your life, all for a ledger and a chance at justice that might not even work." "It'll work? You don't know that." "No, but I believe it." Eliza looked at him, her eyes wet. "Why? Why do you still believe in this?" Ronan thought about that, about the war, about the things he'd done, about the 6 years he'd spent hiding in the mountains because he couldn't face what he'd become. "Because if this doesn't work," he said slowly, "then we're just going to keep running, from him, from the past, from ourselves, and I'm done running. So yeah, I believe it'll work. Because it has to." Eliza wiped her eyes and nodded. "Okay. Okay." She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. After a moment, she spoke again. "What are you going to do after the trial?" "Haven't figured that out yet." "You could stay in Denver. There's work here, opportunities." "Not really my kind of place." "You said that before, but you never said what is your kind of place." Ronan joined her at the window. Outside, the city sprawled in every direction, noisy, crowded, alive. It was the opposite of everything he'd built for himself in the mountains. "I used to think I knew," he said. "Used to think I needed to be alone, away from people, away from everything. But lately I'm not so sure." "What changed?" "You did." Eliza turned to look at him, her expression soft. "Ronan, I'm not saying I've got it all figured out. I don't. But I know I don't want to go back to what I was before, hiding, pretending the world didn't exist. That's not living. That's just waiting to die." "So what do you want?" He thought about it, really thought about it. "I want to build something, not a cabin or a trapline, something that matters, something that lasts." "Like what?" "I don't know yet, but I'll figure it out." Eliza smiled, a real smile this time, not just a flicker. "Yeah, you will." The trial began on a cold morning in early March. The courtroom was packed with reporters, lawyers, railroad officials, and curious onlookers. Eliza sat at the prosecutor's table, her hands folded, her face calm. Ronan sat in the gallery, watching. Her husband arrived in chains, flanked by federal marshals. He was a tall man with sharp features and cold eyes, the kind of man who looked like he'd never smiled a day in his life. When he saw Eliza, his expression didn't change, didn't even flicker. She looked right back at him, unflinching. The trial lasted 3 days. The prosecutors laid out their case methodically. The ledger, the witness statements, the evidence of bribes and murders and stolen payrolls. They called railroad workers who'd been intimidated, families of men who'd been killed, federal agents who'd been investigating for months. And then they called Eliza. She took the stand calmly, raised her right hand, and swore to tell the truth. Then she told it, all of it. The years of abuse, the crimes she'd witnessed, the ledger she'd stolen, the men who'd hunted her across the mountains. Her husband's lawyer tried to tear her apart on cross-examination, painting her as a scorned wife seeking revenge. But Eliza didn't break. She answered every question clearly, directly, without emotion. When they asked about the men in the mountains, she told them about Ronan, about how he'd saved her life, about how they'd fought together, survived together. The jury listened to every word. On the 3rd day, the defense rested. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. When they came back, the foreman stood and read the verdict. Guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted. Reporters scrambled for the doors. Lawyers shook hands, and Eliza just sat there, staring at the table, her shoulders shaking. Ronan pushed through the crowd and put his hand on her shoulder. "You did it!" She looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. "It's over." "Yeah, it's over." They walked out of the courthouse together into the bright afternoon sun. The city was loud and chaotic around them, but for the first time in months, it didn't feel threatening. It just felt like noise. Marshal Crawford met them on the steps. "You're free to go, Miss Vance. The protection order is lifted. You can go wherever you want." "Thank you," Eliza said. Crawford turned to Ronan. "You too, Mr. Hale. You're a free man." Ronan nodded. "Appreciate it." The marshal tipped his hat and walked away, leaving them standing on the courthouse steps, blinking in the sunlight. "So," Eliza said after a moment, "what now?" Ronan looked out at the city, then back at her. "I don't know, but I'm thinking maybe Denver's not so bad after all." She laughed, a real laugh, full and genuine. "You're going to stay?" "For a while, at least, see what happens. And then? Then we figure it out. Together." Eliza looked at him, her eyes bright. "Together." "Yeah." She took his hand and they walked down the steps and into the city. The weeks that followed were strange and new. Ronan found work at a lumber yard on the edge of town, hard, physical labor that kept his mind occupied and his body strong. His shoulders still hurt sometimes, especially when the weather changed, but it was getting better. Eliza found work too, keeping books for a small law firm that specialized in workers' rights. It turned out she had a head for numbers and a talent for finding discrepancies that others missed. They rented a small house on the north side of town, nothing fancy, just 2 rooms and a kitchen, but it was theirs. They furnished it slowly, piece by piece, building something that felt like home. Some nights, Ronan would wake up in a cold sweat, dreaming about the mountains, about the cabin burning, about the men with rifles, about the endless white and the cold that never stopped. Eliza would wake too, and she'd put her hand on his shoulder and wait until his breathing slowed. She never asked what he was dreaming about. She didn't need to. She had her own nightmares. But most nights, they slept peacefully. And that was enough. One evening in late spring, they were sitting on the porch watching the sunset when Eliza said, "I've been thinking." "About what?" "About what you said. Building something that matters." "Yeah?" "I want to do that too. I want to use the settlement money from the railroad to start something. Maybe a shelter for women who are running from bad situations. Give them a place to go. A chance to start over." Ronan looked at her. "That's a good idea." "You think so?" "Yeah, I do." "Would you help me? Building it? Running it? Managing it? Whatever needs doing." Ronan thought about that. Thought about the woman he'd found in the collapsing cabin, shaking and desperate and ready to die before trusting anyone. Thought about how far she'd come, how much she'd survived. "Yeah," he said. "I'd help." She smiled and leaned her head on his shoulder. "Thank you." They sat like that for a while, watching the sky turn orange and pink and purple. The city was loud around them, but it didn't bother Ronan anymore. He'd spent 6 years running from noise, from people, from life itself. He was done running. The shelter opened 6 months later, a modest 2-story building with 10 rooms and a kitchen. They called it Second Chances because that's what it was. A place for people who'd lost everything to find their footing again. Eliza managed the day-to-day operations. Ronan handled the repairs, the security, the problems that required a steady hand and a willingness to stand between vulnerable people and the world that had hurt them. It wasn't easy work. Some days were harder than others. Some people they helped, some they couldn't. But they kept trying. And slowly, the shelter became something real. Something that mattered. One afternoon, almost a year after the trial, a woman showed up at the door. She was young, maybe 20, with dark hair and frightened eyes. She had a black eye and a split lip, and she was carrying a small bag that looked like it held everything she owned. Eliza met her at the door. "Can I help you?" The woman hesitated. I heard this was a place where people could stay if they had nowhere else to go." "It is. Come in." The woman stepped inside, looking around nervously. "How much does it cost?" "Nothing. You stay as long as you need." "I don't have any money." "That's okay. We'll figure it out." The woman's face crumpled, and she started to cry. Eliza put an arm around her and led her inside. Ronan watched from the kitchen, a cup of coffee in his hand. He'd seen this scene play out dozens of times now, but it never got easier, never stopped mattering. Later that night, after the new arrival had been settled in a room and fed and given clean clothes, Eliza found Ronan sitting on the back porch. "You okay?" she asked, sitting down beside him. "Yeah, just thinking." "About what?" "About how different things are now. A year ago, I was alone in the mountains. Now I'm here, with you, running a shelter, helping people." "Regret it?" "No, just surprised, I guess." Eliza took his hand. "Life's funny like that. You spend years thinking you know what you want, and then something happens that changes everything." "Yeah." "You think we're doing any good?" Ronan thought about the woman who'd shown up that afternoon, thought about the others who'd come before her, thought about the fact that people had a place to go now when they had nowhere else. "Yeah," he said, "I think we are." She leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars come out. Survival, Ronan had learned, wasn't just about making it through the next day. It wasn't about being stronger or tougher or more stubborn than the world around you. It was about finding something worth fighting for, something worth building, something worth protecting. For 6 years, he'd thought survival meant being alone, untouchable, safe from the pain that came with caring about people. But he'd been wrong. Real survival, the kind that mattered, meant opening yourself up to that pain, meant standing beside someone when the world tried to tear them down, meant building something fragile and imperfect and beautiful, knowing it might not last forever. It meant choosing who and what you were willing to fight for, and then fighting like hell. He looked at Eliza, at the shelter behind them, at the life they'd built from the ashes of everything they'd lost. It wasn't perfect. It was messy and hard and sometimes painful. But it was real. And it was theirs. That was enough.